Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Why life was brutal in ancient Egypt. A soothing tale for sleepless souls. Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey across the shifting sands of time. As the stars wheel slowly overhead and the hush of night settles around you, I invite you to rest your head and let your imagination unfurl across a desert horizon, to a world both dazzling and desolate. This is ancient Egypt, a land of majesty and myth, of gods carved in stone and secrets whispered through tomb walls, a place where eternity was not a dream but a daily obsession, and where survival, not splendor, was the heartbeat of most. Perhaps you're curled in a quiet room, tucked beneath warm blankets, the hum of the present barely touching your skin. Ask yourself, what part of the world do you now call home? What hour ticks softly by as you prepare to drift into dreams? Wherever you are, whether midnight has just arrived or dawn stirs faintly in the east, know this: you're not alone. If your soul finds rest in tales of the past, in voices that echo softly through time, I welcome you to stay. Subscribe if you'd like to keep walking with us. There are many more stories waiting to be told. But tonight we pause here, beside the Nile, to witness the trials and tribulations of life in one of the most iconic civilizations in history. We remember the towering pyramids, golden sarcophagi, the intricate script of hieroglyphs, and the divine silhouette of pharaohs cast in gold. Our modern minds are often enchanted by the grandeur, lulled by the shimmer of sunlight on stone. And yes, the accomplishments were immense. The scale, the symmetry, the spiritual brilliance of Egypt's legacy is unmatched. But none of it came without cost. Behind every monolith was muscle. Behind every sacred rite, sweat. And behind every king crowned in glory, thousands bowed beneath the weight of survival. Life for the average Egyptian was not gilded in gold. It was chiseled from clay and bone. While pharaohs sailed the Nile in bejeweled barges, the common man carved canals beneath the sun's unrelenting eye. The Nile, giver of life, could also be a taker. Its yearly floods might nourish the soil, but one too strong could bury villages and seed famine. Crops were fragile, disease was rampant, and the desert, for all its beauty, was merciless. The same sun that fired the bricks for eternity's monuments scorched the skin of those who lifted them. And the same gods that promised paradise beyond the grave demanded exhausting devotion from the living. So tonight, as your breath softens and your body begins to release the day, hold space for those who came before us, not just the rulers etched in stone, but the nameless millions whose hands built a civilization and whose pain was the price of its immortality. Rest well, traveler, we have more stories to tell. From the humblest servant to the most esteemed scribe, life in ancient Egypt was a relentless test of the human spirit. Strip away the golden glow of myth and romance, and what remains is a world where survival was hard-won and often uncertain. So come with me now. Let us draw back the veil of nostalgia and gaze into the raw, unvarnished truth of the lives that quietly held up a dazzling empire. Together, we'll explore 6 brutal pillars of existence that defined this ancient land: an unyielding social hierarchy, the crushing demands of labor, the endless shadow of war, hidden perils within their very homes, the ever-lurking threats of disease and injury, and the aching sorrow of loss as they buried their dead again and again. But this isn't just history. Along the way, we'll slow down and step closer, listening for the heartbeat of individual lives. We'll meet not only mighty pharaohs whose thrones were shaken by upheaval, but also nameless craftsmen who bled beneath the sun to feed their children. We'll walk beside widowed mothers, wounded soldiers, and weary scribes, and we'll see their courage not as legend but as daily necessity. Though injustice ran deep and suffering was a constant companion, the Egyptian spirit refused to bow. It endured, fiercely, beautifully, for over 3,000 years. That resilience was not born of ease, but of endurance in the face of adversity. So settle in, dear listener. Let the weight of the modern world fall away for a moment. The Nile is beginning to rise, the sun casts its first golden rays over the cliffs, and there is work to be done. Because in this land of shifting sands and timeless wonders, life, in all its aching beauty and brutal truth, waits for no one. And so, we begin, with the very force that both gave birth to and threatened Egypt's greatness, the river that shaped its soul. The Nile, ancient Egypt's beating heart, was both salvation and threat. Its waters carried life, bringing the rich black silt that transformed desert into farmland, allowing a civilization to blossom where no one else could thrive. But this gift came with no guarantees. Each summer, the river swelled with monsoon rains and faraway snowmelt, spilling over its banks in a primal rhythm that could bless or destroy. The floodwaters engulfed pastures and fields, swept away stone boundaries that marked the edges of life and property. And in homes made of mud brick, families stood at their doorways in silence, watching the creeping tide inch closer. Mothers whispered prayers to Hapi, the god of the flood, begging for mercy. Farmers clenched their hands, helpless before the river that could either nourish their dreams or wash them away entirely. But they desperately needed that flood, not just as a yearly event, but as a sacred rhythm that life itself danced to. It wasn't merely water. It was hope. It was survival. It was the pulse of a nation born from the breath of a river. When the Nile was kind, in a good year it would rise just enough, then gently retreat by autumn, leaving behind a dark, velvety layer of Ethiopian silt, black as night, rich as gold. Into this fertile canvas, farmers flung their seeds with a kind of reverent faith, not just to grow wheat or barley, but to nourish generations, to hold famine at bay, and to honor the gods with abundance. But the Nile was never a tame river. It had moods. And when it chose silence, when the waters whispered instead of roared, the valley trembled. Some years, the flood barely kissed the edges of the land, leaving the earth thirsty and cracked. Crops shriveled before they could even dream of becoming bread. Hunger crept in like a shadow across the fields. Famine became not a fear, but a certainty. Other years, the river came in fury, too much, too fast. It swallowed the very life it was meant to sustain. Seedlings vanished, animals drowned, whole villages disappeared beneath its churning waters, and grief replaced harvest. Even the gods seemed uncertain. King Narmer, the first pharaoh to rule over a united Egypt, learned this truth in the cruelest of ways. Around 3000 BC, in what should have been a season of hope, the Nile fell silent. The flood did not come. The river shrank into a timid stream between scorched banks, and with it, so too, did the kingdom's heartbeat fade. Crops withered into dust, cattle collapsed, little more than skin draped over bone, people began to starve. And Narmer, the mighty unifier of Egypt, could do nothing but watch. Every day, the waters pulled further away. Every night, the silence of the river felt louder. And so the king, desperate to save not only his people but the very soul of his reign, turned to the heavens. He ordered prayers. He offered sacrifices. Legend says he even commanded a young virgin to be cast into the Nile, a final plea to awaken a sleeping god. Still, the river gave no answer. At last, in utter desperation, Narmer made a pilgrimage to Elephantine, the sacred island where the god Hapi, spirit of the Nile, was said to dwell. There, beneath ancient stone, the king fell to his knees. He offered no command, only surrender. He vowed his kingdom, his rule, his legacy, all of it, to the glory of the river, if only the waters would return. And whether by divine mercy or the slow return of the rains, the river rose again. The Nile came back to life, and with it, so did Egypt. But Narmer would not be the last pharaoh to discover, often too late, that the Nile's blessings came laced with quiet threats. It was a truth not fully felt in the opulent palaces of power, but in the fragile mud brick homes of villagers who clung to the river's mercy. There, the annual floods held a kind of divine roulette, bringing either abundance or devastation with no warning and no appeal. This delicate dance with nature bled into every aspect of Egyptian life, especially in how they envisioned death. The ancient Egyptians didn't merely prepare for death, they were consumed by it. To them, dying was not an end, but a crossing, a treacherous passage into the unknown. The soul would embark on a journey through the Duat, a nightmarish underworld swarming with monsters, gods, and moral tests, and only those pure of heart could hope to reach the blessed paradise of the Field of Reeds, a mirror of life on earth, but without pain, hunger, or sorrow. But paradise was never promised. It had to be earned. At the heart of this cosmic judgment was a moment both terrifying and tender, the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Ma'at, the heart of the deceased would be placed on one side of a scale, balanced against the sacred feather of truth. It was not strength that saved you, nor power, nor wealth, only the weight of your conscience. If your heart was heavy with wrongdoing, if your life had left shadows instead of light, the verdict was swift and absolute. Your soul would be devoured by Amit, the soul eater, a chimera of lion, hippo, and crocodile. No rebirth, no reunion with loved ones, just oblivion, a second death, and this time, final. Driven by both fear and longing, Egyptians turned death preparation into an art form, one as precise and heartfelt as it was elaborate. Tombs became sacred sanctuaries, lovingly adorned with everything the deceased might need: food for hunger, games for joy, servants to wait on them, and jewelry to reflect their worth. Every item placed with intention. Every wall inscribed with protective spells and passages from the Book of the Dead. A roadmap for the soul, written in symbols that shimmered with faith and desperation. But the centerpiece of this sacred preparation was the body itself. Through mummification, they preserved not just flesh, but identity, for without a body to return to, the soul would be lost, a wanderer with no anchor. The embalming process was long, delicate, and deeply spiritual. It wasn't just about resisting decay, it was about preserving presence, preserving memory, preserving the hope that death, despite its darkness, could still lead to eternal light. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not the end, but a passage into eternity, a sacred transition that demanded reverence, ritual, and precision. To prepare a body for this journey, the internal organs were carefully removed, the flesh slowly dried in natron salts, and the remains lovingly wrapped in layers of linen soaked in fragrant resins. This wasn't just preservation, it was devotion made visible, a tender conversation between the living and the divine. Even for the wealthy, this process was costly, intricate, and could last as long as 70 painstaking days. But for the pharaohs, believed to be living gods, no measure was too extreme. Their immortality had to be secured not just through ritual, but through gold, grandeur, and unfathomable effort. Perhaps no story embodies this more poignantly than that of King Tutankhamun, the boy king who died suddenly at the age of 19. Though his reign was brief and his life tragically cut short, he was laid to rest in a tomb filled with wonder, a sanctuary of splendor hidden in the Valley of the Kings. Over 5,000 sacred objects were buried with him: chariots that would never ride again, thrones that would never be sat upon, weapons that would never taste battle, and garments he would never wear. And among them, a golden mask that still gazes back at us through time, serene, eternal. When Howard Carter breached the tomb in 1922, the world held its breath. The treasures dazzled not just the eyes, but the imagination, a glimpse into a civilization's longing to hold on to life beyond death. But even Tut, for all his riches, was just a fleeting figure in Egyptian history. One can only wonder what unimaginable treasures lay with the great pharaohs, Khufu, Amenhotep III, Ramses II, whose rule spanned decades and whose names echoed like thunder through the centuries. Yet most of their tombs, their sacred sanctuaries, were plundered long ago. Precious relics were stolen, their bodies desecrated, scattered. Even Tutankhamun's tomb, for all its glory, had been robbed, not once but twice before its final sealing. The Egyptians lived with a deep and constant fear, not of death itself, but of its violation. They built tombs like fortresses with hidden doors, false corridors, deep shafts, and traps meant to deceive and deter. Guards were stationed, priests performed daily rituals, curses were etched into stone, chilling warnings to any who might disturb the sanctity of the dead. These weren't mere threats. Grave robbing was a crime met with the most savage of punishments. Execution was not the end. The condemned were often denied burial, cutting off any hope of eternal peace. One ancient account, told by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, paints a haunting image. At the funeral of Ramses II, perhaps Egypt's most revered ruler, his son, amidst the sorrow of the procession, caught sight of a thief tunneling into the royal tomb. Even in mourning, the shadows of desecration loomed. It is a tragic irony that a civilization so obsessed with eternity could not protect its dead from time's cruelties and human greed. Yet their desperate efforts, their gold, their curses, their prayers, still whisper to us thousands of years later from beneath the sands. The prince could have ended it right then and there. He had the power, the opportunity, but he chose to wait, to let the thief continue just a little longer, not out of mercy, but strategy. He wanted not just one man, but the entire brotherhood of desecrators caught red-handed. And when the trap was finally sprung, The fate that awaited them was not just punishment, it was terror made flesh. Diodorus writes with chilling clarity, "The king gave orders that the robbers should all promptly be put to a horrible death to deter any others from like attempts. They were placed still living on skewers and roasted to death over a slow fire." Their agonizing end was meant as a message, a searing monument to the sacredness of the line between the living and the dead, a line no mortal was meant to cross. And yet, even that fire could not extinguish the greed that haunted Egypt's tombs. Not even the hidden necropolises, carved into the secret cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, could keep the dead safe. By the time of Ramses IX in the 12th century BC, tomb robbery had become not an aberration, but an epidemic. In desperation, the pharaoh dispatched a special commission, hoping to salvage dignity for the dead. Among them was a scribe, Ammon-Panafer, who returned with a report that read like a lament. He described devastation, the mummies of once great kings and queens, unwrapped, desecrated, thrown like refuse onto the earth. Stripped of their jewels, robbed of their silence, their twisted remains were left to rot, exposed to the teeth of rats and jackals. Even the godlike Ramses II had not been spared. His body, once treated with reverence and ritual, had been pried open by hands driven by hunger for wealth. His sacred eyes, onyx and precious stone, gouged from his skull. The investigators swept up suspects from every rung of society. It wasn't just the poor or desperate. It was stonecutters, carpenters, even city officials and priests. The corruption had spread into the bones of the kingdom. One goldsmith, Ammon-Panafer, confessed, not with shame but a startling bluntness that made the horror even more palpable. "We tunneled into the corridors of the tomb of King Sober-Saf. We found the king's mummy inside, covered in gold and many jewels. We stripped off the gold and jewels that we found on the mummy of the god, as well as the amulets and ornaments which were around his neck. We found the royal wife as well. We took everything we found on her too. We set fire to their mummy cases and we stole their furniture, vases of gold, silver, and bronze. It was not merely theft. It was a betrayal of the dead, of the divine, of everything the ancient Egyptians believed stood between chaos and order. The tomb was meant to be eternity, but even eternity could be broken open, plundered, and burned. The robbers, it seemed, were unmoved by the promise of divine wrath or the terror of a tortured death. The golden treasures buried beneath the desert sands called to them louder than fear, a siren song in a world racked with hunger, grief, and desperation. Even the sacred rest of the pharaohs, believed to be protected by gods and curses alike, could not escape human need. Perhaps then the Egyptians' deep obsession with death was not morbid, but necessary. They did not merely believe in the afterlife, they clung to it. When life itself was so cruel, so fragile, so filled with suffering, eternity became not just a hope, but a lifeline. For kings and commoners alike, death was always nearby, in the desert sun, in war, in famine, in betrayal. Mummification was more than ritual. It was a cry for permanence, a desperate reach for something the Nile could never promise: safety, peace, time. Tombs were built like fortresses, filled with sacred words and golden offerings, not to flaunt wealth, but to beg the universe for mercy beyond the grave. But even that mercy was not guaranteed. The dead, so carefully preserved, could not escape the living. Grave robbers tore open eternity for a handful of riches, and the great gamble of the afterlife that it would bring peace was one that not everyone would win. Still, one boy king did. Tutankhamun lay undisturbed for more than 3,200 years, until Howard Carter, with trembling hands and gasping wonder, opened the door to a world long vanished. Now, the young pharaoh lives again, not in the underworld, but in glass cases, in glowing museums, in the eyes of millions who stare in awe. He has become a symbol of beauty, mystery, and endurance, a golden whisper from a world that refused to be forgotten. And as we fall asleep tonight, wrapped in our warm beds, surrounded by electric lights, safe from hunger and conquest, perhaps we might pause and remember the people who faced the darkness with only myths and hope, who carved their dreams into stone and buried them in the sand, who longed, just as we do, to be remembered, to be more than dust. Even for mighty pharaohs like Thutmose III, who ruled in the 15th century BC, life was not ease, but endless battle. He led 17 military campaigns, not for glory, but because the world demanded it. Power in Egypt was not a shield, it was a burden. And behind every victory lay the same truth, that no matter how high you rose, the shadow of death still followed. To secure Egypt's frontiers against rising threats, the greatest challenge facing the pharaohs of the time came not from within, but from beyond the eastern horizon. The Canaanite city-states of what is now Syria and Palestine had grown bold, powerful, and restless. After years of watching their influence expand, Thutmose III knew the moment for reckoning had arrived. In the spring of 1457 BC, he led his army out of Egypt, away from the familiar banks of the Nile and into the harsh unknown of the Sinai. What followed was no ceremonial march, but a brutal trial of endurance. The desert did not welcome them. Under the pitiless sun, men stumbled through sands, lips cracked with thirst, skins seared by the heat. Water became more than necessity, it became prayer, and still they marched. At last, the weary Egyptian forces reached the highlands of Canaan. There, like a storm gathering at the edge of the sky, their enemy waited at Megiddo. A vast alliance of Canaanite warriors, thousands strong, chariots gleaming like fire in the sun, had taken position beneath the shadowed slopes of Mount Carmel. Their flanks, guarded by nature itself, they seemed unshakable. Thutmose stood at a crossroads, both literal and fateful. He could take the long, safer road, circling the mountain and allowing the enemy time to regroup, or he could lead his men through a narrow mountain pass, barely wide enough for single-file advance. It was a path of ambush, of certain bloodshed, of risk that bordered on madness. But Thutmose chose courage over caution. As his troops pressed into the tight defile, the mountains came alive with death. From the cliffs above, a rain of arrows and stones fell like judgment. Men cried out, not just in pain, but in fear. Horses shrieked and buckled. The canyon became a crucible of screams and shattered bone. But the pharaoh did not yield. His voice, steadfast, commanding, cut through the chaos, urging his soldiers onward. When they finally emerged from that narrow hell onto the open plain before Megiddo, they were bloodied, battered, and hardened by fire. And there the true battle began. Chariots crashed like thunder, swords clashed, sparks flying from bronze. Dust rose in choking clouds as men fought not for glory, but for survival. It was a struggle of will as much as weapon, a test of heart beneath the banners of gods and kings. In the end, Thutmose's discipline and brilliance broke the Canaanite coalition. The enemy fled, shattered and leaderless, pursued all the way to the city's gates. Megiddo stood silent witness as the victors claimed the field. Later, Thutmose would boast of his triumph, of the 340 prisoners captured by his own hand, of the thousands of horses and chariots seized. But numbers could never truly convey what was won that day, or what was lost. Behind each tally was a name, a face, a final breath drawn beneath foreign skies. This was not merely a victory. It was a declaration that Egypt would not be threatened, not while Thutmose III drew breath. And the world, for a time, believed him. The Battle of Megiddo marked a stunning victory for Thutmose, but it was not the end, not even close. Though he had triumphed on the battlefield, the surviving Canaanite forces retreated behind the thick, defiant walls of the city. And there the war dragged on, silent but merciless. Thutmose's men, though victorious, were weary, their bodies aching from days of combat, their spirits thinned by hunger and uncertainty. Megiddo's defenses stood strong, unbroken. No gate welcomed them. No weakness revealed itself. So the pharaoh made a brutal decision. He ordered the construction of a massive wooden palisade, a wall to trap the city in a slow death. It was not a quick blow of the sword, but a grinding suffocation. Thousands of trees were felled, stripped of life to build the barrier that would steal the breath from Megiddo. Week after week, the Egyptian soldiers labored in choking dust and relentless heat. They were far from home, their only shelter, the canopy of a foreign sky. They built, they waited, and they endured. Inside the walls, the people of Megiddo began to starve. Their children cried with empty bellies. Disease crept in like a shadow. What once was pride became desperation. And in time, even desperation gave way to silence. The will to resist crumbled, not in battle, but in slow, invisible suffering. After 7 long, soul-draining months, the gates of Megiddo opened, not with force, but with surrender. Thutmose walked in as a conqueror. He claimed the city's treasures, its rulers, and the hollow remains of its resistance. It was, by all measures, a great victory. But it was not clean. It was not glorious. The siege had cost dearly. Thutmose's army had faced not just enemy blades, but starvation, sickness, and fear. They lived in the constant shadow of death, haunted by the thought they might never return to their homes, never again see the faces of those they loved. Even in victory, the soldiers were left with scorched fields, bloated corpses, and the ghosts of battle lingering in their minds. This was empire, not just built in blood, but maintained in endless sacrifice. And Megiddo was only the beginning. Thutmose would go on to seize many more Canaanite cities, stretching Egypt's reach all the way to the Euphrates. But every conquest tightened the strain back home. Every campaign meant fewer hands on the plow, fewer artisans at the wheel. Egypt's glory grew heavy, a burden borne by warriors, farmers, and forgotten families alike. The flow of tribute from conquered lands filled the royal coffers with gold, ivory, and luxury, symbols of imperial grandeur. But for the common people, this wealth was distant, untouchable. Their lives remained marked by toil, not triumph. In truth, it was they, the farmers, laborers, and village youth, who bore the heaviest weight of empire. The insatiable demand for manpower led to a surge in forced labor and conscription. And for the average Egyptian, being drafted, whether into the army or into a royal labor gang, was not a mark of pride, but a profound rupture. It meant being torn from home and kin, thrust into the unknown. It meant endless marches under the punishing sun, sleeping on bare ground, surviving on meager rations, and facing the raw terror of war. To fight hand to hand was not an act of glory. It was a nightmare made real. But sometimes the more agonizing fate came without a blade: disease, exhaustion, dysentery, or heat stroke. For many, death didn't come on the battlefield, but in the slow erosion of body and spirit, worked to death in silence, far from any monument or memory. This bleak truth echoes faintly through ancient voices like that of Amenemheb, an army officer under Thutmose III. In his tomb inscriptions, he does not boast of luxury or ease. He recounts horrors, crossing crocodile-choked rivers, marching through searing sandstorms that stripped skin from flesh. He tells of clambering over mounds of the dead, comrades and enemies alike, just to reach the next fortress wall. One chilling detail stands out. Thutmose once ordered the severed hands of the slain to be stacked before him, each one a grotesque token of conquest. In another tally, we find a macabre inventory: 1,692 hands, 29 severed genitals, as if human suffering could be reduced to mere numbers in a ledger of dominance. These were the bloody receipts of empire. They proclaimed power, yes, but they also revealed the merciless cost. They were symbols not of strength alone, but of a time when human life was fuel for the pharaoh's ambition. And the suffering did not end with soldiers. The conquered, too, knew cruelty intimately. Cities that dared resist were razed. Their people, men, women, children, slaughtered or enslaved. Prisoners were beaten, tortured for information, paraded as trophies. Many never saw their homeland again. Many never saw another sunrise. Behind the glittering facade of empire lay a world soaked in blood and silence. A world where the cries of the forgotten still echo unheard beneath the sand. We glimpse the cruelty of conquest in a chilling passage from the annals of Thutmose III, Egypt's warrior king. It recounts the fate of a rebellious Canaanite ruler. His Majesty captured the city of Joppa. He carried off its chief, his wife, his children, and all his possessions. He razed the city, sowed it with barley. As for its chief, he hung him up in front of the city that had been his. It wasn't just a victory. It was a message carved in suffering, a clear, brutal warning to all who might dream of resistance. Defy the pharaoh, and you will not simply fall. You will be destroyed, humiliated, and made into a spectacle of fear. These were not mere military campaigns. They were acts of psychological warfare, designed to paralyze opposition before it could ever rise. And for many of the oppressed people of Canaan, it worked. The yoke of Egyptian imperialism would hang heavy on the region for generations. And yet, back home in Egypt, while their king bathed in triumph and scribes etched his victories into stone, the common people remained untouched by glory. The bloodshed won territories, but not relief, not food, not rest. For the average Egyptian, the battlefield was not some distant land. It was the field they tilled, the bricks they stacked, the debt they inherited. Most lived and died as peasant farmers, laborers, or conscripts. The monuments raised in honor of Egypt's kings may gleam in golden light today, but their foundations were laid with the sweat, tears, and broken bodies of the poor. And even in times of peace, Life was no gentle reprieve. It was a struggle, unrelenting and often hopeless, that began at birth. For an Egyptian child, the world was perilous from the first breath. It's estimated that 1 in 3 infants never made it to their first birthday. Those who survived infancy faced a gauntlet of silent killers: malnutrition, deadly infections, parasites, unsafe water, and constant physical danger. Only about half of all children lived past the age of 5. Imagine that, every second mother losing a child, sometimes 2, sometimes more. Imagine growing up knowing the odds were against you from the start. This was the shadow behind the sunlight of ancient Egypt. A civilization of splendor, yes, but also of quiet suffering, endured by the nameless millions whose stories were never written in stone. The evidence of ancient sorrow lies quietly beneath the sands, in the cemeteries of Egyptian villages where heartbreak is etched into rows of tiny graves. Childbirth, that most universal miracle, was also a moment of profound danger. For both mother and child, it teetered on the edge of life and death. Without the aid of modern medicine, many women succumbed during labor, from hemorrhage, from seizures, from the unbearable agony of an obstructed birth. Midwives, armed with little more than ritual and hope, recited spells and performed sacred gestures. But magic could not mend a torn womb or restore a breath that would not come. When complications arose, as they often did, the mother's life was prioritized. If the baby was trapped, sharp instruments might be used to dismember the fetus in the womb, a horrific but tragically routine attempt to save the woman. It is a brutal reminder of the harrowing choices they faced in silence. Not even the royal household was spared. Several of Thutmose III's wives and daughters perished in childbirth, among them his beloved eldest daughter, Neferu. The pharaoh who commanded empires was rendered helpless before this most intimate loss. He buried her with solemn reverence, placing her tiny sarcophagus in the Valley of the Kings, a monument not only to her rank, but to the love that death could not dissolve. So prevalent was the death of infants and children that many Egyptian families delayed naming their newborns. They withheld hope, trying not to fall in love with a life that might not linger. And yet, when the worst came, it devastated them all the same. Loss was woven into the fabric of life, its weight inescapable. But so too was love. The Egyptians believed that the soul of a child, like any adult, needed care beyond the grave. And so they buried even the youngest with miniature possessions: a comb, a tiny pot, a carved figurine, tokens of a life cut short, yet still deserving of remembrance. In some instances, the dead were honored with stunning tenderness. From the city of Huara comes the story of a young mother who died during childbirth, her baby lost with her. Someone, perhaps a husband, perhaps a midwife, took exquisite care to mummify them together, while the infant gently posed at the mother's breast as if still nursing in eternal sleep. It is a touching image, but it is not rare. These intimate, aching rituals reveal a society shaped by the constant shadow of child death and by the unbreakable bond between parent and child, even in the face of the unthinkable. Those children lucky enough to survive infancy were not met with comfort, but with hardship. Their reward for survival was labor. From a young age, they were sent into the fields beneath a relentless sun, tasked with herding livestock or apprenticed into crafts they did not choose. Play was a luxury. Schooling, a dream reserved for the sons of the elite, scribes, priests, or those with proximity to power. For the rest, childhood was a brief interlude before a life of toil. For the average Egyptian, life was a narrow path between hunger and duty. Every season brought the same grinding fears. Will the Nile rise? Will the crops grow? Can we pay what is owed to the state and the landlords and still have enough to... And always, there was the river. The Nile, giver and taker. Its floodwaters were the heartbeat of Egypt's agricultural cycle, but they were also fickle and cruel. If the waters surged too high, villages vanished beneath the current. People and animals drowned, swept away without warning. If the waters failed or withdrew too early, the soil would crack, and with it, the hope of harvest. Famine would rise like smoke on the horizon, slow and inescapable. Even a slight deviation in the flood could unravel thousands of lives. One famine, carved into history by the noble Anktifi during the First Intermediate Period, tells of such unraveling. His inscription reveals a land in turmoil, grain prices soaring, desperate mobs looting for survival, starving northerners fleeing southward in search of food. Onctifi, from his position of power, paints himself as a savior, but the tone is chilling. He fed his own people, yes, but denied aid to the refugees even as they perished at his gates. He writes, the whole land has become like locusts going in search of food. The people in the village are coming to my territory with their children on their backs to get grain here to live. I am the one who buries those who died on the road out of fear of the royal anger. Those fleeing famine faced another horror, the wrath of the king. In a world ruled by fear and scarcity, dying on the road became preferable to returning home and facing punishment for trying to survive. Their lives were not simply poor. They were precarious, oppressive. Every breath was subject to forces far beyond their control: floods, pests, politics, and power. And though the first intermediate period was marked by collapse and chaos, this fragility was not unique to it. Even in more stable eras, swarms of locusts or grain beetles could devour a quarter of the harvest. A single season of misfortune could mean starvation, not just for individuals, but for entire villages. This was the rhythm of ancient Egypt for the common people. Survival measured in floods and famines, in obedience and silence, in a world where life itself was always on the edge. And the pressure to hand over a sizable portion of their crop to the state left many farmers on the knife's edge of subsistence. For peasants, hunger was a constant companion, and the threat of losing everything was never far from mind. Many fell into debt during hard times and were forced to surrender their meager plots to powerful landlords. Court records show an endless litany of foreclosures, with whole families taken into bond servitude when they failed to pay up. These debt slaves could be bought, sold, rented out, or bequeathed like any other property. Their dependent status offered them little recourse against abuse and exploitation. Even for Egyptians who owned their own land, the demands of corvée labor could be crushing. During the flood season, when they couldn't farm, peasants were often conscripted to work on the pharaoh's monumental building projects. This forced labor was supposed to be a form of in-kind taxation, but it frequently devolved into outright slavery. The work itself was backbreaking, hauling heavy loads of mud and stones under the scorching sun. Men dropped from exhaustion, were crushed by falling blocks, or simply worked to death. We can see the human toil behind the great monuments in the ruins of the workers' village near the Giza pyramids. Skeletons found there show severe arthritis, especially in the lower vertebrae, a sign of long hours spent bent under heavy loads. Many have fractured limbs that healed crookedly, a mark of inadequate medical care. One poignant burial contains a couple still holding hands, united in death as they probably were in life's hardships. Of course, even in these humblest of remains, archaeologists have found evidence of care and humanity. Graves were dug with some goods to provision the deceased in the afterlife: a prized tool, a bead necklace, or a chunk of meat wrapped in linen to feed them for eternity. Family members who could afford even the smallest gesture of mummification would often do so, not out of luxury, but out of love. They would painstakingly remove the organs, dry the body in salt, and wrap what they could, knowing it might be the only act of dignity left to offer. These humble rituals were more than tradition. They were acts of devotion, fragile attempts to preserve memory in a world that too often erased the poor without a trace. Yet, even these quiet honors could not conceal the brutal truth of life for Egypt's laboring class. In one mass grave near Giza, a woman's skeleton was found still curled around her infant child, a last desperate embrace frozen in time. Both bore the signs of malnutrition, of relentless toil. Both likely died at their post, collapsed beneath the weight of work that never ended. Their names are lost to history. Their suffering until now was too. These were the invisible pillars of the pharaoh's vast empire, the ones who bled and broke to raise stone to sky, only to be discarded in the dust beside the monuments they built. For all its splendor and divine pageantry, ancient Egypt was, for most, a land of hardship and silence. Life was short and it was merciless, especially for those born at the base of the great social pyramid. They fought daily against heat, hunger, and disease. Their backs ached beneath the lash of labor, and there was no ladder to climb. Even those higher up, nobles, scribes, and priests lived in the shadow of instability. Court life was a battlefield of favors and rivalries. A fall from grace, whether through political misstep or divine disapproval, could mean exile or ruin. No one was ever entirely safe. Perhaps that's why the Egyptians, so known for their order, their rituals, their reverence for Ma'at, the sacred balance, also harbored a deep and vivid fascination with its opposite. Within the tombs of the elite, among solemn carvings and sacred hymns, are strange and mischievous images. Cats herding geese, mice declaring war, humans with animal heads, animals acting as royalty. These were more than jokes. They were windows into another world, an imagined inversion, where the heavy chains of order loosen just enough to allow a breath of absurdity, of rebellion. In one satirical papyrus, even the gods themselves are mocked. Drunk at a banquet, slinging insults, petty and cruel. Ra, the great sun god, casually commands that his guests be flayed, their skins turned into sandals. It is grotesque, yes, but also liberating. These stories gave voice to what could not be said aloud: the suffering of the poor, the fear of the powerful, the yearning for a world that didn't hurt so much. In their laughter, their irreverence, the Egyptians glimpsed a reality unbound by duty, law, and divine punishment. Just for a moment, they could imagine a world undone and maybe rebuilt. Even the Egyptian concept of the afterlife bears the imprint of their uniquely precarious existence in a world where starvation and death were always close at hand. The Field of Reeds was not just a paradise, it was everything this life was not. An eternal harvest, a world without pain where crops grew effortlessly and no one ever hungered. A place of rest, of wholeness. But it was never promised, it had to be earned. To reach this sacred paradise, the dead were required to live righteously, honor the rituals, obey the gods, and the king who spoke in their name. But even those deemed worthy faced a perilous road. Death was only the beginning. The soul embarked on a terrifying journey through the underworld, a realm of shadows and dread. Lakes of fire bubbled beneath them, venomous serpents coiled in ambush, and the monstrous devourer, part crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, waited hungrily for those who failed. To survive, the deceased needed more than courage. They needed spells, precise words etched into coffins wrapped in linen, whispered by priests. They carried charms and amulets, small enchanted statues to guard their every step. But none of it would matter if their heart, the core of their being, did not pass the final test. On the scales of judgment, their heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the divine essence of truth. If the scale held balance, they were reborn into eternal joy. But if their heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it was cast down, devoured, erased from existence, denied both life and afterlife. Yet while they dreamed of eternity, the Egyptians also turned their genius to the present, seeking to push back death with science as well as faith. Their civilization was astonishingly advanced in medicine. In a time where most of the world knew little beyond magic and guesswork, the Egyptians studied the human body, developed surgical tools, and recorded their knowledge with astonishing detail. One of the most compelling artifacts we have is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text over 3,600 years old, written with the precision of a seasoned practitioner. It describes 48 surgical cases, each one a window into the mind of a physician trying to hold death at bay. In one harrowing case, a man came with a shattered skull, a compound, comminuted fracture. In modern terms, his head had been crushed into fragments. The ancient surgeon did not panic. He examined the wound with his hands, gently probing the break, observing the patient's symptoms, carefully diagnosing the extent of the damage. And then, in a scene that stirs both awe and dread, he reached in and began to remove the bone shards from the man's head. With tools forged in a world without anesthesia, without sterilization, he tried to rebuild what fate had broken. It was brutal, it was primitive, but it was also the beginning of something extraordinary, a human desire to heal, to preserve, to fight the inevitable. And through it all, in life, in death, in the shadowed lands beyond, the Egyptians sought not just to survive, but to endure, to matter, to reach something eternal. Keep in mind, this surgery was performed without the benefit of anesthesia or sterile techniques. The excruciating pain, the sheer unimaginable agony of having your skull cut open while fully conscious, and yet somehow the patient survived. What kind of strength or desperation does that take? The Edwin Smith Papyrus records how the wound was treated, first disinfected with honey, then bound with raw meat, laid over it like a primitive poultice. And miraculously, the man lived. The papyrus notes, in words both clinical and haunting, "Thou should say concerning him, one having a gaping wound in his head, penetrating to the bone and perforating the sutures of his skull." It's a stunning testament to the surgical skill of ancient Egyptian physicians. But more than that, it's a window into the suffering their patients endured. In a time without anesthesia, without antiseptics or antibiotics, healing was often its own kind of torment. Even the most basic procedures, stitching a wound, setting a fracture, draining an abscess, could feel like a slow form of execution. Egyptian medicine, for all its innovation, was deeply rooted in pain. Practices like burning, leeching, and bloodletting were common, their agony masked only by the hope that they might bring relief. The Edwin Smith Papyrus reads like a battlefield diary: crushed vertebrae, shattered collarbones, torn flesh. One case describes a man kicked in the chest by a horse, and you can almost hear his last breath through the page. But what the papyrus doesn't say, archaeology does. Mummified remains whisper of lives ravaged by suffering: abscessed teeth, broken bones, malnourishment, parasitic infections, tuberculosis, malaria. Even in death, their bodies bear the marks of survival, of struggle, of joints worn down by labor, of spines bent by years of burden. For most Egyptians, life wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Disease, hunger, and injury loomed constantly. And if you were lucky enough to find a doctor, the cure might hurt more than the illness. It's humbling, even haunting, to realize that comforts we now see as basic human rights, a dose of antibiotics, a numbing injection, a clean hospital bed, were once beyond imagination. To be sick in ancient Egypt was to stand alone at the edge of pain, hoping that suffering might bring salvation, or at least survival. Yet in the face of such relentless challenges, the ancient Egyptians persevered with remarkable grit. Through countless trials, errors, and hard-won experience spanning centuries, their physicians crafted a profound body of practical medical knowledge, far beyond what many other ancient cultures could claim. They set broken bones with splints, carefully sutured gaping wounds, and even dared to perform basic surgeries. In many ways, the story of ancient Egyptian medicine stands as a testament to human resilience and ingenuity thriving amid unforgiving conditions. But it also serves as a powerful reminder of how far we have come. The next time you suffer a cough or a simple cut, pause for a moment to appreciate the incredible advancements in medical science that now allow us to heal swiftly and with almost no pain. Spare a thought for those ancient healers whose world was shaped by far harsher realities. The gleaming scalpels and sterile wards of a modern hospital would have seemed like magic to an Egyptian physician laboring thousands of years ago under the scorching sun and with limited tools. As we've uncovered in this series, life in ancient Egypt was a relentless struggle for all, from the crushing heat and unforgiving environment to war, disease, and social injustice. Hardship was woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Viewed through modern eyes, the conditions they endured seem almost unimaginable in their brutality. And yet, despite it all, the ancient Egyptians forged one of the most enduring and captivating civilizations in human history. Through their centuries of struggle and triumph, over more than 3 millennia, they left an indelible imprint on the human story, one that continues to captivate and inspire us today. There is perhaps a profound lesson here, a testament to the unyielding tenacity of the human spirit even in the darkest of times. As we close this chapter on ancient Egyptian history, take a quiet moment to reflect on all we have discovered together. From the towering halls of the Great Pyramids to the humble, squalid huts of the poor, we have sought to paint an immersive portrait of life in this legendary ancient land. The reality we've seen is often harsher and harder than our romantic imaginings. But that reality also makes the achievements of the Egyptians all the more remarkable. The next time you see the majestic mask of Tutankhamun or the towering pyramids of Giza, I hope you'll appreciate them in a new light. These wonders were born out of a world of struggle and strife we can scarcely imagine. They are enduring testaments to the grit and greatness of a fascinating civilization that, through great adversity, reached for the stars. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient Egypt. Although our time here was brief, I hope you found it both enriching and engaging. History has so many remarkable stories to tell if we only take the time to listen. Even an era as distant as Egypt's Old Kingdom, still has much to teach us about the human condition and our shared past. And with that, our Egyptian adventure must come to an end. But the annals of history are always calling, filled with incredible tales just waiting to be told. I hope you'll join me again soon for another not-so-boring journey back in time. Until then, this is your faithful history guide, bidding you good night and sweet dreams of pyramids and pharaohs. Be well, and I'll see you next time. The life of a pharaoh may seem glamorous and carefree from our modern perspective, all gold and glory, grandeur and power, fawning subjects, and monumental building projects to make their names last forever. But the sobering truth is that even for these god kings perched at the top of Egyptian society, life could be brutally short. Take, for example, the mighty warrior pharaoh Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century BC during Egypt's powerful 18th dynasty. Thutmose was an aggressive military leader who launched around 17 campaigns in just 21 years, constantly expanding Egypt's empire into Syria and Palestine to the northeast. His most famous victory came in 1457 BC at the Battle of Megiddo, where his forces crushed a rebellious Canaanite coalition and captured the strategic walled city after a 7-month siege. The spoils of war were vast: over 2,000 horses, nearly 1,000 chariots, hundreds of bronze armor suits, and large amounts of precious metals. Thutmose showed no mercy. He executed opposing chieftains and their sons and took their women and children back to Egypt as slaves. But the cost was steep, even for a so-called living god. While his empire brought Egypt great riches and made Thutmose the most powerful man of his time, it also forced him to spend much of his life on faraway battlefields, far from the comforts of home. Being a soldier in ancient times was brutal. Marching for weeks under the scorching desert sun, wearing heavy bronze armor and fighting with bulky weapons like spears, axes, and shields in messy, violent combat. Wounds from bronze weapons were often severe and deadly, especially in dirty battlefield conditions that could quickly turn infections fatal. Even as supreme ruler, Thutmose was not spared from the ever-present dangers faced by all ancient warriors: dehydration, heat stroke, infected injuries, and disease spreading through crowded military camps. He likely saw hundreds, if not thousands, of his men, maybe even close friends or family, die painful deaths far from the rich black soil of the Nile. One near-contemporary record tells of Thutmose III breaking down in tears after a victory, mourning his fallen brothers who would never return home. After a 54-year reign filled with non-stop warfare, Thutmose III didn't die on the battlefield. He passed away at home in Memphis at the age of 56, an unusually long life for an ancient Egyptian. When his mummified body was discovered in 1881, it showed signs of suffering: painful dental abscesses and hardened arteries, a reminder that even the mightiest pharaohs were not immune to pain and aging, and severe arthritis, perhaps from old battle injuries. Even Thutmose the Magnificent, ancient Egypt's greatest imperialist, was ultimately humbled by the physical costs extracted by a life of brutality and conquest. While the pharaohs and nobles enjoyed a relatively lavish lifestyle compared to the masses, even the highest in Egyptian society could not escape the harsh privations of their time. Disease, injury, infection, overwork, and malnutrition did not discriminate by class or rank. If anything, the weighty expectations and dangers faced by rulers like Thutmose III brought unique miseries and hardships all their own. From within their mud brick hovels, the average Egyptian could perhaps be forgiven for looking up at the gold-bed pharaoh with not only reverence, but quiet envy. Yet beneath the glittering surface of ancient Egypt's grandeur lies a harsher truth, a shared burden borne by both kings and commoners alike. Life, whether at the gilded throne or the dusty fields, was marked by relentless adversity and suffering, often hidden behind the dazzling facade of power and prosperity. The struggles of the pharaohs, though immense, pale in comparison to the daily brutalities endured by those at the very bottom of the social ladder: the peasants, servants, and slaves, whose backs bore the weight of backbreaking labor and servitude. While mighty rulers like Thutmose III commanded armies and governed from opulent palaces, shielded by wealth and authority, the vast majority of Egyptians wrestled with the unforgiving forces of nature and unyielding oppression, without hope for mercy or escape. For these countless souls, the foundation of Egypt's state and economy, Life was ruled by the capricious rhythms of the Nile River. In years when the floodwaters arrived on time, swelling with life-giving abundance, they left behind a rich blanket of black silt that nourished fields heavy with wheat, barley, figs, and pomegranates. Such bounty allowed a handful of nobles, scribes, artisans, and priests to flourish, maintaining the elaborate machinery of the kingdom. But when the Nile's generosity faltered, disaster loomed. Too little water meant cracked, parched earth. Crops shriveled and died, leaving famine's cruel grip to strangle the land. Too much water brought fierce currents that tore open the soil and burst dikes, drowning villages beneath merciless floods, wrecking homes and livelihoods, and drowning the precious harvests in stagnant waters. In either fate, it was the peasants who bore the first and fiercest blows. Their hunger grew. Their toil became more desperate, their suffering deeper. Behind the glory of empire was a fragile existence where life balanced precariously between hope and despair, all dictated by the ever-changing pulse of the Nile. The shadow of disaster loomed long over ancient Egypt, none more devastating than the Great Famine during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty between 2686 and 2649 BC. Ancient inscriptions recount a harrowing 7-year drought when the life-giving Nile withheld its floods, leaving the once fertile fields barren and the people desperate. A chilling account known as the Famine Stela paints the grim reality in stark words. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger to such a degree that everyone had come to eating their children. The entire country had become like a starved grasshopper, with people going to the north and to the south in search of food. Those who built tombs, those who carried stones, they all stopped working. With the riverbeds dry and the land parched, the pharaoh was forced to break open the royal granaries, desperately importing food from distant lands to stave off complete societal collapse. Yet despite these efforts, countless lives were lost to starvation and the diseases that followed in its wake. The Palermo Stone, an ancient chronicle, coldly records the death toll as uncountable multitudes claimed by famine. Even outside such catastrophic years, the threat of scarcity was a constant specter, always lurking just beyond a single failed harvest. Peasant families, making up some 80% of Egypt's population, lived in cramped, fragile homes built from mud and reeds. Their diet was simple and meager: bread, beer, onions, lentils, and dried fish. Sanitation was primitive, fueling the spread of disease that ravaged their fragile bodies. The toll was especially cruel for children, with as many as half not surviving beyond their first year, felled by malnutrition and infection. From early youth, Egyptians were bound to a life of back-breaking toil from dawn until dusk, whether in the fields, the building sites, quarries, or mines. Farming, the backbone of survival, was a grueling battle against the scorching desert sun. With wooden plows and bare hands, they planted and harvested wheat, barley, and flax, hauling water from the Nile's banks to nourish the thirsty soil. And all of this hard-earned produce was handed over to the state as taxes, a heavy burden on already fragile lives. During the flood season, when crops rested beneath the rising waters, peasants not occupied with tending livestock were often conscripted into labor gangs for monumental public works. Their sweat and sacrifice shaped the towering pyramids, eternal tombs built for the Old Kingdom's mighty rulers, standing as silent testaments to the cost of empire. The first and largest was the Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed around 2550 BC for the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khufu. This colossal monument, originally soaring to 481 feet and spanning 13 acres, was built from over 2 million enormous limestone blocks, each weighing about 2.5 tons. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus claimed it took 100,000 men working in rotating 3-month shifts over 2 decades to complete the pyramid. Modern Egyptologists revise this number to between 20,000 and 40,000 workers, still a staggering human effort. This monumental project demanded an unimaginable amount of labor and suffering. Most of the work relied on the simplest tools: ramps, sleds, rollers, levers, copper chisels, bronze saws, wooden rollers and sledges, and ropes made from papyrus and leather. Injuries were frequent and severe. Falling blocks, pulley failures, and scaffold collapses caused broken bones and crushed limbs. Years of grueling labor left workers with muscle and joint damage, hernias, deep cuts from stone tools, infected wounds, blistered skin, and heat stroke. Archaeological excavations at workers' cemeteries near the Giza pyramids reveal the harsh realities behind these eternal monuments. Skeletons show numerous healed fractures, severe arthritis, spinal deformities, and missing limbs, stark, grim proof of the brutal toll exacted by relentless labor. Yet, as difficult as life was for the average conscripted peasant, it was even more brutal for those at the bottom of Egypt's hierarchy, the slaves. Captured prisoners of war or those who fell into debt, slaves were forced into the harshest and most dangerous work, toiling in mines, quarries, and fields, with even less rest and fewer rations than peasants. Their suffering built the foundations of Egypt's glory, their pain etched into the stones that still stand today. One of the most notorious places was the gold mine of Bir Fawakir in the eastern desert. This desolate, searingly hot landscape was a virtual death camp for the slaves and prisoners sent to mine gold for the pharaoh's treasure. An account from the reign of Amenemhat III of the 12th dynasty, circa 1860 to 1814 BC, describes the hellish conditions in vivid detail. Those who are sent to the mine daily suffer hardship tenfold: scorched skin, bleeding feet, failing breath, broken bones. In summer, the miner's face is baked like an earthen pot. His bones are burned like summer flax. His skin hangs loose, ulcered, and gashed from the stones. Starvation was a constant threat, with small rations that left miners malnourished and vulnerable to disease, especially silicosis from inhaling rock dust in the tunnels. Beatings from guards were common for those who slowed down in their endless labor. Many died from injuries, illness, snake bites, or sheer exhaustion in this dry valley of suffering. Life expectancy for a slave in the pharaoh's mines was often measured in mere months, not years. So while the shimmering gold artifacts displayed in the Cairo Museum reflect the wealth and glory of Egypt's god-kings, they also represent the unimaginable human suffering that made such splendor possible. Behind every dazzling death mask and gleaming sarcophagus lie the forgotten bones of countless faceless workers, crushed in service to a kingdom that saw them only as fuel for the machinery of monarchy. Even those spared a life of servitude in the fields, mines, and work sites still faced daily dangers and struggles in the Nile River Valley. The natural environment of ancient Egypt, while fertile, was also filled with deadly threats. The Nile itself, the giver of life, was also a frequent bringer of death, thanks to its apex predators, the Nile crocodile and the hippopotamus, which could grow up to 20 feet long. And weighing as much as a ton, the Nile crocodile was a fearsome ambush predator that haunted the imaginations of ancient Egyptians. With its armored hide, crushing jaws, and explosive speed, this cold-blooded killer took a steady toll and fished, washed, and drew water along the riverbanks. Children were especially vulnerable, snatched suddenly and dragged to a thrashing, drowning death in the river's murky depths. The hippopotamus, despite being a herbivore, was one of the most fearsome threats along the Nile due to its fierce and unpredictable temperament. Male hippos fiercely defended their territory, while females attacked without warning to protect their young. A full-grown bull could weigh as much as 3,000 pounds, charge at speeds up to 20 miles per hour, and with a single powerful snap of its massive jaws, crush a crocodile or a human as easily as crushing a grape. For those who made their living on the river, boatmen and fishermen, hippo attacks were a constant, terrifying danger. One chilling story from the 12th dynasty, 1991 to 1802 BC, tells of a herdsman named Tabu, who was stalked and mauled by a lion while tending his cattle near the river. Though he survived, his plea to the local governor reveals the raw terror he endured. "A lion came at me. He hunted me as I fled, his teeth bared and his claws extended. 3 times he sprang upon me, and 3 times I used my spear to fend him off, but he kept coming. At last I fell, and he stood over me, his putrid breath on my face. I knew my end had come, but the gods, for some reason, spared me that day." Tabu's close encounter with death exposes the fragile nature of life in a land ruled by powerful predators, where help was scarce and survival uncertain. Even the lion, the king of beasts, was a threat to those at the bottom of the social order. Yet perhaps the deadliest enemies were not the giant beasts, but the tiny, relentless insects that plagued both people and animals. Mosquitoes rising from the Nile's stagnant floodwaters spread malaria and yellow fever, devastating communities. Biting black flies carried onchocercis, a disease that caused blindness. Filth flies swarmed around rotting waste, spreading dysentery and intestinal infections. Lice and fleas infested hair, clothing, and bedding, tormenting their victims with constant itching and discomfort. In the harsh world of ancient Egypt, dangers lurked both large and small, ever-present threats that shaped daily life with fear and suffering, and biting. But by far, the deadliest insect was the humble desert locust. When conditions were right, these voracious grasshoppers gathered into ravenous swarms of biblical proportions, darkening the skies and descending on fields to strip them bare of all vegetation in a matter of hours. A single swarm could number in the billions, covering hundreds of square miles and consuming over 400 million pounds of crops per day. For ancient Egypt's farmers, who eked out a precarious living from the Nile's floodplain, a locust plague was a catastrophe of existential proportions. One ancient text, known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, from the First Intermediate Period, 2181 to 2055 BC, describes the devastation in apocalyptic terms. What shall we do about it? All is ruin. The storehouses are bare. Behold, we are plundered by the locusts. The fields are desolate and the food is gone. The children wail, I am hungry, but there is nothing to give them. How long can we survive? Such locust plagues were disturbingly frequent in Egypt's long history, triggering famines that unleashed starvation, disease, civil unrest, and even societal collapse. Even the pharaoh, in his palace, could not escape the repercussions, as starving masses left barren fields to crowd into the cities, straining resources and threatening rebellion. Many scholars believe it was a series of locust-driven famines and droughts that ultimately toppled the Old Kingdom around 2200 BC, ushering in a dark age of chaos and fragmentation. So whether by large predators or tiny insects, the natural world posed endless dangers for ancient Egyptians, rich and poor alike. But perhaps the greatest danger came not from without, but from within, from the cutthroat machinations of power politics among Egypt's ruling elites. In a rigid hierarchy where life and death were the prerogatives of the pharaoh and his inner circle, court intrigues and plots swirled like scorpions in a bottle. One of the most notorious examples comes from the end of the 17th dynasty, around 1550 BC. The pharaoh Seqenenre-Tao, who ruled Upper Egypt from Thebes, was caught in a brutal, drawn-out struggle with the Hyksos kings, who had occupied Lower Egypt and the Delta for over a century. Ancient records tell of a bitter feud between Seqenenre and the Hyksos ruler Epi, a conflict born from wounded pride and clashing claims to power. In the shadows of this deadly rivalry, Seqenenre's fate was sealed by betrayal. His own court, perhaps even in league with his enemies, turned against him. When his mummy was discovered in 1886, it told a grisly tale. His skull was shattered, pierced by at least 5 brutal blows. His nose crushed, cheekbones and jaw broken, splinters of bone driven deep into his brain. The violent end of a king, revealed in the silent testimony of his remains. Scholars still debate the exact circumstances, but many believe Seqenenre was murdered, either in his sleep or while restrained during a palace coup. The hurried mummification, with no effort to hide his horrific injuries or remove his brain, speaks to killers desperate to erase evidence and cover their crime. In the wake of his death, his wife Ahotep took up the mantle of leadership, holding the kingdom together until their son, Ahmose I, was ready to rule. But the dangers did not end with political murder. Some of ancient Egypt's harshest punishments were reserved for those who dared rob the dead. The treasures buried with pharaohs and nobles, jewelry, statuettes, furniture, were too tempting for many desperate souls in the lower classes. Tomb robbery was a perilous but potentially lucrative crime. To guard against it, authorities stationed armed guards to patrol tombs and cemeteries. They constructed bewildering labyrinths of corridors, dead ends, and traps to confuse intruders. Hidden entrances concealed burial chambers, while priests cast magical curses on the mummified bodies inside, promising torment to any who dared disturb the eternal rest of the dead. This fierce protection reflected the profound sacredness ancient Egyptians placed on the afterlife and the terrible consequences awaiting those who violated it. But even with strict precautions, tomb robbery remained an unrelenting plague upon ancient Egypt. When thieves were caught, the punishments were merciless and horrific. There were no half measures. A swift, agonizing death was only the beginning. To fully punish the criminals and send a terrifying message to any who might follow their path, Egyptian justice took on a dark, symbolic cruelty. During the reign of Ramses IX in the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BC, tomb robbery had exploded into an epidemic. The pharaoh's agents captured a band of thieves who had long plundered the tombs of nobles, and the interrogation records reveal a grim account of their fate. Under torture, the prisoners confessed to defiling countless tombs across Egypt over many years. The immense wealth they had stolen was long gone. Nothing remained to recover. For their unforgivable transgressions, the authorities condemned them to an elaborately macabre execution. First, while still alive, the thieves' noses and ears were severed. This cruel act was meant to rob them of sensory pleasures in the afterlife. With agonized screams, the men were then impaled upon sharpened stakes, left to writhe in excruciating torment as death claimed them. But the cruelty did not end there. In a final act of spite, their desecrated bodies were gathered and delivered to a special embalmer. Though reeking of blood and fear, the thieves' remains were mummified carefully, according to sacred rituals. Each body, once destined for eternal preservation, was instead shamefully buried in a mass grave. Their organs and belongings were scattered and desecrated. This gruesome spectacle served as a dire warning to all who dared violate the resting places of the dead. Not only would they suffer a cruel and painful death, but their chances of a blissful afterlife would be utterly destroyed. Denied the necessary rights and equipment, their souls would be lost between worlds, condemned to endless torment. Though such punishment may seem excessively harsh to us, to the ancient Egyptians, the tomb robbers' horrific fate was seen as just and necessary justice. The afterlife was of supreme importance, a sacred realm that shaped every facet of ancient Egyptian life. The construction of pyramids and tombs consumed immense resources, monuments not just of stone, but of faith and hope for eternity. To steal sacred grave goods was more than theft. It was a wound to the spirits of the dead and a profound betrayal of the divine order that held society together. Such an insult demanded the harshest retribution, swift and terrifying. Yet, not every tomb robber met such cruel justice. Many thieves operated with the complicity of corrupt officials, shadows lurking within the very system meant to protect the dead. Still, the savage punishment of a particular gang during the reign of Ramses IX remains a stark reminder of the deadly risks woven into the lure of easy riches. Life itself may have been short and brutal for the average Egyptian, but death held even darker fears. Those who transgressed in life risked eternal suffering rather than eternal reward, and endless torment beyond the grave. The dreadful penalties for tomb robbery were perhaps the ultimate expression of Egypt's obsession with the afterlife. While the elite hoarded immense wealth in gilded palaces, the threat of mutilation and damnation kept the lower classes in fearful obedience. One might almost pity the thieves, executed in horrors beyond imagining, were it not for the sacred weight of their crimes. In a culture so bound to death and the afterworld, no punishment seemed too severe. Beyond the famous pyramids of Giza, Egypt was a land of tombs, silent, ominous portals bridging earth and spirit. They beckoned to the desperate and daring alike, offering the promise of rich plunder and the peril of unimaginable suffering. Under the ruthless justice of the pharaoh, to steal from the dead was to condemn one's own soul. The grisly fates of Ramses IX's tomb robbers stand as a chilling warning. In a realm where the lines between the natural and supernatural often blurred, violating the eternal rest of the deceased invited horrors that mortal minds could scarcely fathom. Whether taken as historical fact or apocryphal tale, the execution of the tomb thieves offers another chilling glimpse into the severity of ancient Egyptian life and death. For the average Egyptian, so much of life revolved around staving off the ever-present specters of poverty, pain, and oblivion. But even in death, there could be no escape or mercy for those who violated the sacred and social orders. In this unforgiving world of backbreaking labor and swift retribution, perhaps the only thing worse than suffering through life was facing the eternal consequences of one's earthly misdeeds. So while the magnificent monuments along the Nile still dazzle us with visions of Egypt's golden age, it pays to remember the blood and bone that supported those lofty ambitions. Behind each titanic stone was 100 forgotten tragedies. Beneath each shining treasure was an abyss waiting to consume the unlucky and the criminal. Though they could be unspeakably cruel, perhaps practices like the ghastly execution of tomb robbers were inevitable in a society so fixated on the worlds beyond. With cosmic order and immortal glory at stake, even petty crimes took on metaphysical weight. When your gods could devour your soul, what could be worse than the wrath of kings? In the final analysis, life along the Nile was perhaps little different than anywhere else in the ancient world. The mighty few enjoyed power and luxury, while the anonymous multitudes toiled and suffered in the dust. The difference was in how the Egyptians codified this stark divide between throne and throng in their spiritual beliefs. If a peasant was worked to death or executed for theft, it was divine will manifest. The social order, like the annual floods that nourished the Black Land, had its ultimate source in the gods. To the pharaohs and priests, even the cruelest deeds were justified in service of upholding the eternal balance. There could be no mercy for those who threatened the cosmic symmetry, in this life or the next. The thieves who dared to undermine the sacred compact between the living and the dead had to be destroyed utterly, their wretched souls scattered like chaff in the desert wind. For in ancient Egypt, the boundary between order and chaos was perilously thin, and the cost of crossing it was unimaginable. So, the next time you stand in awe before the towering monuments of the pharaohs, pause for a moment to remember the countless forgotten souls whose lives were spent and often lost in their creation. Think of those who toiled in the city of the dead, the tomb builders who shaped eternity with aching hands. Reflect on those who dared to steal from these sacred places, knowing that such defiance meant courting oblivion itself, a fate worse than death. Yet, despite the brutal weight of forced labor, the people of ancient Egypt found small flickers of humanity and dignity amid the hardship. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of worker villages nestled near the pyramids, communities where conscripted laborers and skilled artisans lived through the long years of relentless construction. Their skeletal remains tell stories of pain, arthritis, herniated discs, and wounds from ceaseless toil. But even under crushing burdens, these workers carved out moments of existence, small islands of life and resilience amid the harshness of their world. The lives of these laborers extended beyond mere toil. They had families, communities, and moments of humanity amid hardship. Archaeological digs reveal that they lived in modest mud brick apartments arranged neatly in rows like a small village. Each dwelling sheltered 4 to 8 workers, likely organized into close-knit teams. This village wasn't just a place to sleep. It had communal dining halls where they shared meals, breweries crafting the beer that was a staple of their diet, and kitchens baking the bread that sustained their strength. Such provisions indicate they were at least properly fed and housed, not simply discarded as expendable slaves. Evidence of social bonds emerges from potsherds and limestone flakes that served as rudimentary writing surfaces. Some still bear simple inscriptions, heartfelt messages like "Friends forever" or "May you be well and healthy." The discovery of children's toys and carved game boards hints at moments of leisure and the presence of families within the labor camps. When death came, it was met with care. Some workers were buried thoughtfully, accompanied by small grave goods, tokens of respect and remembrance. Together, these details paint a vivid picture of real people, not anonymous laborers, enduring together against unforgiving conditions. The relentless, back-breaking labor beneath the punishing desert sun must have drained their bodies and spirits. Yet within the camps, these pyramid builders found small comforts: a modest meal, a sip of beer, a game shared among friends, offering brief escape from their burdens. These simple reprieves likely made the difference between soul-crushing despair and a harsh but bearable existence. Still, their servitude was forced and inescapable. No loaf of bread, no cup of beer could erase the deep injustice of their captivity. These workers were not volunteers, they were captives, bound by circumstance and power beyond their control. As we conclude today's journey, how do you feel about the story of struggle and resilience in ancient Egypt? Has this deeper glimpse helped you appreciate the silent sacrifices behind those magnificent wonders? If you found this content meaningful, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss more captivating stories ahead. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams under the gentle glow of the moon. Good night and sleep well.